The night stretched endlessly, a silent ocean of darkness pressing against the small walls of Clara's room. The clock ticked softly beside her bed, each second a reminder that time was both gift and weight. Her hands trembled as she clutched the blanket close, feeling the ache deep within her bones, the kind of ache that speaks of endings. Breathing felt heavier now, like the air itself had grown tired. She stared at the ceiling and whispered, "So this is how it feels to fade." The lamp cast a weak circle of light over the nightstand, revealing the small Bible she hadn't opened in days. She wanted to pray, but the words no longer came easily. Her faith, once steady and bright, had dimmed like the candle of her strength. The fear wasn't of death itself, it was of being forgotten before she even left. "Lord," she murmured, "are you still near?" But only the hum of silence answered. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, brushing against her window like a sigh. She thought of the life she'd lived, the laughter, the faces, the hands she'd held. So much had slipped away, friends gone, family distant, dreams faded like old letters. What remained was a body too frail to move and a soul too weary to fight. Yet still, she waited for morning, because waiting was all she knew how to do. Her breathing grew shallow as pain rippled through her chest. She closed her eyes, trying to imagine heaven, not golden streets or angels, but simply rest. "If you're ready for me," she whispered, "let it be gentle." The room felt smaller somehow, like the world was folding inward around her. Each heartbeat seemed to echo louder, slower, uncertain. And then, as her eyes fluttered between sleep and waking, she thought she saw something. Faint light in the corner of the room, soft and trembling, but when she looked again, it was gone. She smiled weakly. "Maybe you're closer than I think," she said. Then she turned her head toward the window and let the night hold her, quietly waiting for the dawn she wasn't sure she'd see. Morning came pale and cold. Clara rose slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, and shuffled toward the small mirror by the window. The woman looking back startled her. Thin hair of silver, eyes sunken but kind, a face marked not by vanity, but by life. She studied herself in silence, tracing the deep lines that told her story. "So much living," she whispered, "and yet it feels like yesterday." She remembered the laughter of her youth, the wind in her hair, the sound of her husband's voice calling her name across the fields. How strong she had been then, certain that time would always stretch ahead. Now, it folded behind her like a long closing curtain. The mirror didn't show illness. It showed time itself, patient and undefeated. Still, there was something soft in her reflection, a spark that refused to die. She leaned closer and smiled faintly. "You've seen it all," she told her reflection. "Joy, loss, grace, and fear." Her fingers trembled against the glass, as if to comfort the woman staring back. It struck her then, how much she had endured, and how quietly she had done it. There was strength, even in fragility, a kind of holiness, perhaps, in surviving. Behind her the bed was unmade, the Bible still unopened, yet she felt something shift inside, a memory of who she used to be. Strong, steady, faithful. "You're still her," she whispered to herself. "You just forgot." The thought was small, but it flickered like light. For a moment she almost believed it. She turned away from the mirror and drew back the curtain. The sky outside was grey, the world muted. But far in the distance, a line of gold broke through, morning sun fighting its way through clouds. Clara watched it for a long time, her heart stirring faintly. "Maybe the end isn't all shadow," she said. "Maybe there's still light left." The next day, Clara sat in the clinic, her hands folded neatly in her lap, waiting. The doctor entered gently, his eyes kind but heavy. He spoke softly, using words like progression and comfort measures. She nodded, hearing the meaning behind them. There would be no recovery, only time. "You've been brave," he said. "Now it's about rest." She smiled politely, though her heart sank beneath the weight of finality. On the walk home, she felt the cold air bite against her skin. The world looked the same, cars passing, leaves fluttering, yet everything had changed. People walked by, full of purpose and life, unaware that her story was nearing its close. She envied their urgency, their busyness, their unawareness of how precious time really was. Each step home felt longer than the last. When she reached her front door, she paused, hand on the handle, and whispered, "So this is it." There was no bitterness in her voice, only fatigue. She had always known life was temporary, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly smaller. Inside, the house greeted her with silence, the kind that waits for decisions to be made. She placed the doctor's note on the table beside her Bible. Two truths lay side by side, one from the world, one from heaven. "You both can't be right," she said softly. Her fingers brushed the thin paper, then the worn leather cover of scripture. "If this one's true," she murmured, tapping the Bible, "then maybe the other doesn't get the last word." She sat down, closing her eyes, letting the quiet settle around her. For now, she didn't know what to believe. But somewhere deep inside, a question began to form, one that had not stirred in years. What if there's still something left for me to see? The following days unfolded like the soft turning of pages. Clara moved slowly through her home, touching things she once took for granted: the teacup her husband used, the photograph of her daughter as a child, the worn chair by the fireplace. Each held a story, each whispered goodbye. She was not afraid of dying, only of leaving too quietly, without her love being remembered. She began to organize drawers, fold linens, and label keepsakes. Every gesture was an act of closure, an offering of peace. She wrote small notes. "This was your father's favorite. Keep this for when you need courage." As though her love could outlive her body through words. The house filled with soft paper rustling and the faint scent of lavender. Some afternoons she would sit and talk aloud, as if her husband still sat across from her. "I'll see you soon," she'd say, smiling through tears. "Save me a place by the window." The conversations brought her comfort. It made the silence feel less sharp. Death felt less like an ending and more like returning home. One evening she opened the window and let the cool wind fill the room. The curtains swayed like gentle hands waving farewell. "I've done my part," she said quietly. "If this is the end, let it be kind." Yet even as she said it, she felt a strange tug within her, a small, persistent pulse of longing that refused to let go. She lay down that night ready for rest, her affairs in order, her soul surrendered. But as sleep began to take her, one thought rose softly in her heart. What if God hasn't finished yet? It was faint, fragile, but real. And in that fragile space between doubt and faith, hope stirred for the first time in years. Clara sat at the kitchen table that morning, pen trembling in her thin hand. The paper before her was blank, a fragile mirror of all the things she still wished to say. Her daughter lived far away, caught in the rhythm of her own family and job, always promising to visit soon. Clara didn't blame her. Life moves quickly for the young, and slowly for those waiting at the end of it. She smiled softly and began to write. "My dearest Anna," she started, her letters neat but faint. "If this finds you, I want you to know I never stopped praying for you. I hope you're happy, truly happy, and that you teach your children to laugh as you once did." She paused, her eyes misting. "Don't cry for me, love. I have lived long enough to know that love doesn't end. It changes home." The ink smudged as her hand trembled. She took a deep breath and pressed on. "When you think of me, don't picture the sickness. Remember the mornings when we sang in the kitchen, the smell of bread baking, the sun through the window. I'll be there in those moments. That's how heaven lets us visit." Her smile deepened as she wrote. By the time she reached the end, her hand was weak. "Tell your children I love them, even if they don't remember me, and tell them Jesus is kinder than the world ever taught me. He's been patient with me. I think I'll see him soon." She laid down the pen, her eyes shining with quiet peace. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest before placing it in an envelope. "You'll read it when the time is right," she whispered. Then she placed it on the counter by the door, a message for when her voice could no longer speak, a piece of her heart left behind in ink. The days that followed were silent and long. The phone didn't ring. No footsteps passed her gate. The world seemed to have forgotten she was still there. She used to fill her hours with books, music, small chores. Now, even those felt heavy. The house had become a companion of shadows, loyal, familiar, but never answering back. Sometimes she spoke to God aloud, just to fill the emptiness. "I'm not angry," she'd say, standing by the window. "Just lonely." Her voice would echo softly against the walls. She imagined the sound climbing through the ceiling, rising past the roof, disappearing into the clouds. Maybe prayers didn't need to be perfect. Maybe they just needed to be honest. One afternoon, she sat outside, the sunlight thin but kind on her skin. The garden had grown wild, the flowers stretching in defiance of neglect. She smiled faintly at them. "You don't wait for permission to live, do you?" she murmured. "You just bloom." Her heart ached with both envy and admiration. Life, she realized, still wanted her to notice. That night, she stood in the middle of her living room and listened, not for sound, but for meaning. The silence wasn't cruel. It was waiting. She could feel it now, that something or someone was near. Not in sight, not yet, but near. She took a deep breath, her chest tightening slightly, and whispered, "Don't let me leave without hope." Then she sat back in her chair, wrapped her blanket tightly, and let the quiet cradle her. For the first time in a long time, the loneliness didn't feel empty. It felt full, like soil before a seed breaks open. Something was about to grow. The pain woke her before dawn, sharp and deep. She clutched her chest and breathed through it slowly, eyes wet but steady. When it eased, she whispered, "Still here." Her voice was almost a sigh. She turned her face toward the window, where faint light was beginning to creep through the curtains. The world was still asleep, but her soul was wide awake. She tried to pray, though her mind was tired. "If I must go," she murmured, "let it be peaceful. But if you're not finished with me yet, give me strength for another day." The words were thin, like threads in the dark, but they reached somewhere she couldn't see. She let them hang in the air, knowing heaven had heard them even before she spoke. Her body trembled with weakness, yet her spirit felt strangely alive. She thought of Jesus, not distant on a throne, but near, walking quiet roads, sitting with those the world had forgotten. "You'd sit here with me," she whispered, smiling through tears. "You'd understand what this kind of waiting feels like." She imagined him beside her, listening without judgment. For a long while she simply breathed, in and out, in rhythm with her heart. The pain didn't disappear, but it no longer frightened her. She began to sense that her prayer had already been answered, not with healing, but with presence. Sometimes strength, she realized, wasn't about standing up. It was about not giving up. As the first ray of sun slipped into the room, Clara lifted her face toward it and closed her eyes. "Thank you for this breath," she whispered, "even if it hurts." The light warmed her cheeks gently, and for a moment she felt held, as if an unseen hand had brushed away the fear she had carried through the night. The morning passed without event, quiet and slow. The house was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Clara sat in her chair, her hands folded loosely in her lap, waiting for something, anything to happen. She had prayed, and now she waited. But nothing came, no voice, no warmth, no vision, only silence, stretching wide and endless. At first the silence felt like rejection. She thought of all her years of faith, of every whispered prayer that seemed to vanish into the air. "Maybe heaven's too busy for one old woman," she said with a tired smile. Yet even as she spoke, she felt something within her refuse to agree. "No," she whispered back to herself, "he still hears." She decided not to fill the silence this time. Instead, she listened to the soft ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of the curtains in the wind. Each sound, though ordinary, began to feel sacred. Life hadn't stopped speaking. She had simply forgotten how to listen. The stillness began to change in texture, no longer empty, but deep. It was as if the silence itself was breathing, alive and full of waiting grace. "You're here, aren't you?" she said softly. "You just don't rush." The words made her smile. They felt like truth, gentle, steady, and kind. She closed her eyes and leaned back, her heartbeat slow, her spirit calm. The silence no longer frightened her. It wasn't the absence of God, it was the space where he entered unseen. And in that sacred quiet, Clara's weary heart began to believe again. That evening the pain returned, slow and merciless. Clara pressed her hand against her heart and waited for it to pass, but this time it did not. The air grew thick, her breaths came shallow. She looked toward the window where dusk was folding the light into shadow. "Maybe this is it," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Maybe I'll close my eyes tonight and not wake again." She wasn't afraid, just tired. The kind of tired that seeps beyond the body, into the soul. She thought of her daughter, of the letter waiting on the counter, of all the mornings she'd prayed for one more day. "It's enough," she whispered. "I've lived enough." Yet even as she said it, tears came. A part of her still longed to live, not out of fear but of love. She lay back, closing her eyes, her breath unsteady. The world around her dimmed. The sounds of night began their soft chorus. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, a clock struck 9, a train passed far away. Everything continued as usual, except her heart, which slowed its rhythm, heavy and deliberate. She whispered one last time, "If you're near, take me gently." For a moment, there was only stillness. Then, somewhere deep inside, she felt warmth begin to gather, not in her body, but in her spirit. It was faint, like the first touch of sunrise. She frowned weakly, wondering if it was a dream. But no, dreams don't feel this real, this kind. The warmth grew, spreading slowly through her chest, melting the fear she didn't know she still held. Her eyes filled with tears again, but they were different now, not born of pain, but of awe. She realized she was not dying alone. "You came," she whispered, barely audible. The air seemed to shimmer, and the silence answered softly, without sound. "I never left." The night deepened, and Clara felt herself floating between worlds, not fully here, not yet gone. Her breathing eased. The pain had vanished entirely. The air was still, heavy, yet comforting, like the hush before dawn. She could sense that something sacred had entered the room. It wasn't visible, but its peace filled every corner. She opened her eyes slightly. The lamp by her bed glowed softer than usual, as though wrapped in gold. Shadows no longer frightened her. They seemed gentle, purposeful. "What is this?" she whispered. "It feels like peace." Her hand trembled as she reached toward the light, and though nothing visible touched her, she felt held. A calm she had never known before settled over her. It wasn't sleep or surrender, it was assurance. Every fear, every doubt, every regret that had haunted her heart simply dissolved. "You're really here," she said softly, a smile forming through her tears. "I thought you'd forgotten me." The stillness seemed to breathe with her, tender and alive. Time lost its shape. Minutes and hours no longer mattered. She felt only presence, vast, unhurried, eternal. It was as if heaven had opened quietly inside her small room. For the first time in years, she felt safe, truly safe. She rested her head against the pillow, eyes closed, her lips still moving in prayer. But this time, she wasn't asking. She was listening. The world outside slept on, unaware that something divine had drawn near. Inside, the air shimmered faintly with light unseen. Then it came, soft as a sigh, gentle as the breeze through an open window. A voice, quiet but unmistakable, spoke her name. "Clara!" She froze, tears spilling instantly down her cheeks. It wasn't sound she heard. It was something deeper, resonance, truth, love. "I am here," the voice said again, and her heart broke open. She wanted to speak but could only weep. Every word of that voice carried comfort too great for expression. It wasn't commanding, wasn't distant. It was familiar, like the sound of home after a long journey. "You've waited so long," he said softly. "You've carried so much. Rest now. I am with you." The warmth she had felt earlier deepened, filling her entirely. She could feel her pulse steady, her breath ease, her fear melt away. "I thought I'd been forgotten," she whispered between sobs. "Never," came the reply, tender and sure. "Not for a moment. I was in every silence, every prayer, every tear." She covered her face with her trembling hands, overwhelmed by the kindness in those words. This was not imagination. This was not hope pretending. This was presence, pure and real. The peace that filled her chest felt alive, as though it had its own heartbeat. Love itself had entered her small room and chosen to stay. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small but clear. "Then don't leave me," she said. The silence that followed glowed with light. "I never will," came the answer. And in that moment, she believed, fully, finally, completely. The night passed gently into dawn. The pain that had ruled her days was gone, replaced by warmth that pulsed through her like quiet music. Clara opened her eyes to a soft light filling her room. It wasn't the cold grey of morning. It was golden, alive, sacred. The air itself seemed to breathe with her. She sat up slowly, expecting weakness, but found strength instead, not of the body, but of spirit. Her hands, though thin and frail, no longer trembled. She touched her chest and smiled. "You're still here," she whispered, remembering the voice from the night before. It hadn't been a dream. She knew that now. Her heart felt light, unburdened by fear. For so long, she had waited for healing to mean a body restored, but now she understood. Healing had come in her soul instead. She had been touched where medicine could not reach, where time could not harm. "This is what hope feels like," she said softly, tears of gratitude on her cheeks. She walked slowly to the window and opened it wide. The morning breeze carried the scent of wet earth and blooming jasmine. Birds sang from the trees, unaware of the miracle that had unfolded through the night. She breathed in deeply, letting life fill her lungs. For the first time in months, she wanted to live. The light that filled her room didn't fade as the sun rose. It seemed to grow stronger, clearer. It wasn't outside her anymore. It lived within. She smiled and whispered into the morning, "Thank you for remembering me." And somewhere, in the stillness of heaven, the answer came again, "I never forgot." Clara sat by the window long after sunrise, her Bible open on her lap. The pages, worn thin from years of touch, fluttered softly in the breeze. Her eyes fell on a verse underlined long ago, now faint but familiar, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." She read it aloud, her voice trembling with awe. It felt as if the words had been waiting for this very morning. For years, she had repeated those words in prayer, never realizing they were not a promise to chase, but a truth that had been keeping her all along. "You really didn't leave," she whispered, tracing the verse with her finger. The ink had faded, but the meaning had not. A soft laugh escaped her, not from amusement but recognition. God's promises, she realized, don't grow old. They wait patiently until we remember. She leaned back in her chair, the sunlight warming her face. Memories flooded her, moments when she had doubted, when she had begged for proof, when she had mistaken silence for distance. All the while, he had been near. Every unanswered prayer, every quiet tear had been noticed. "You were there," she said softly, "even in my forgetting." The house felt different now, lighter, alive. What had once been empty air now carried quiet assurance. Hope wasn't loud, it was steady. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when grief finally loosens its hold. The end she had feared no longer felt like loss, it felt like arrival. She closed the Bible gently and placed her hand over it. "You kept every word," she murmured, "even the ones I stopped believing." Then she looked toward the garden, where a bird had landed on the railing, its small wings trembling in the light. Life had returned, not in grand miracles, but in promises fulfilled quietly, one heartbeat at a time. The next morning, Clara awoke before the sun. For the first time in months, her body didn't ache with the same relentless pain. Her legs were weak, yes, but her spirit felt anchored. as if something strong and unseen held her steady. She swung her feet slowly over the edge of the bed and sat upright, breathing deeply. "Let's see what today holds," she said, smiling to herself. She stood, wavering at first, but she did not fall. The world tilted slightly, then righted itself, as though honoring her courage. Each step was small, measured, deliberate, a quiet victory with every inch. She moved to the kitchen, her hands brushing against the walls that had once witnessed her despair. Now, they witnessed her resurrection. The kettle hissed softly on the stove, the scent of tea filling the air. She hummed a tune she hadn't sung in years, a hymn from her childhood, half-remembered but full of joy. The melody rose faintly, wrapping around her like sunlight. Even her voice, cracked and soft, sounded new. "I thought my song was gone," she said, laughing quietly. "But you kept it for me." After breakfast, she opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold morning air stung her cheeks, but she welcomed it. The world seemed brighter, more alive. She could feel the pulse of creation, not as something separate from her, but as something she belonged to again. "Thank you," she whispered, "for another morning." She stayed there for a long while, watching light break through clouds. Her body was still frail, but her heart was strong. She realized that miracles sometimes begin not in healing, but in rising, in the courage to stand when the world expects you to stay still. Hope, she thought, is just faith taking a deep breath. That afternoon, Clara wandered outside, the ground damp beneath her feet from the night's rain. The air was sweet and earthy, carrying the scent of new growth. Her small garden, once neglected, had begun to stir with life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the soil, stubborn and radiant. She knelt slowly beside them, tears gathering in her eyes. "You never stopped growing," she whispered. "Even when I did." Her hands sank into the cool earth, the feeling grounding her in ways prayer alone never could. She pulled a few weeds, her fingers tracing the fragile stems of flowers still learning to bloom. It struck her how much her soul resembled this garden, dormant, hidden, but never truly dead. "You bring things back to life," she said softly, "even old women like me." She stayed there for hours, humming gently, talking to her plants as if they could hear her. Perhaps they could. The garden had always been her sanctuary, her place of work and worship. And now it had become her altar of gratitude. Every petal, every blade of grass seemed to whisper back, "See, life continues." When she finally stood, her knees ached, but her heart felt light. She looked up at the sky, a canvas of soft gold and blue. "You've given me another spring," she said, smiling through tears. It wasn't about years anymore. It was about moments, the sacred kind that remind you eternity can be felt even now. As she walked back toward her porch, a breeze brushed past her, carrying the faint scent of jasmine. It felt like a promise kept, quiet, gentle, eternal. She closed her eyes and breathed it in deeply, whispering, "You remembered me." The next day, a soft knock echoed through her door. Clara froze. She hadn't heard that sound in weeks. Slowly, she shuffled to the entrance and opened it. There stood a young woman from down the street, holding a basket of bread. "I'm sorry to bother you," the girl said, smiling shyly. "I just felt I should check in on you today." Clara blinked, surprised. "You're not bothering me at all," she said, her voice warm but trembling. The girl stepped inside, glancing around the little home with curiosity and care. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Peaceful." Clara smiled. It wasn't always, but someone changed that recently. The girl nodded, not understanding, but sensing something holy in her tone. They sat together at the table, sipping tea. The girl spoke about her worries, her job, her loneliness, her fear of the future. Clara listened quietly, her heart moved. When the girl finished, Clara reached across the table and took her hand. "Hope isn't gone," she said softly. "It's just waiting to be noticed. Jesus doesn't leave the broken, he rebuilds them quietly." The girl's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know why I came today," she said, "but now I do." Clara squeezed her hand gently. "He sent you," she replied with a knowing smile, "so I could remember, and so could you." The moment hung between them, tender, and true. When the girl left, the house no longer felt empty. Clara stood at the window, watching her disappear down the road. "You still send people, Lord," she whispered, "just when we need them most." The sunlight fell across her face, and she smiled. Hope, she realized, multiplies when it's shared. The next morning, Clara woke with a thought she hadn't felt in years: purpose. It came quietly, without grand revelation, like a whisper finding its way through her heart. She sat at her table with a cup of tea and her old stationery beside her. The blank page no longer frightened her. "Maybe my story still has something left to give," she said softly, smiling. She began to write, slowly at first. Letters, not just to her daughter this time, but to neighbors, to friends long lost, to anyone who might need a reminder that hope can bloom again. She wrote about her nights of fear, her prayers in silence, the moment when light returned. Her words were tender, simple, and full of truth. "Jesus met me," she wrote, "not when I was strong, but when I was ready to let go." Day after day, she filled pages. The pain in her hands no longer bothered her. It felt like holy work. She didn't write to be remembered. She wrote because hope demanded to be shared. "If even one heart feels less alone," she whispered, "then this breath is still worth taking." The letters piled high, each one carrying part of her resurrection. The mailman noticed the growing stack one morning and asked, half smiling, "Writing a book?" She laughed gently. "Something like that," she said, "just trying to send light while I still can." He nodded, not understanding the depth of her words, but feeling their warmth nonetheless. And each time she sealed an envelope, she prayed over it. "Find the one who needs this," she'd whisper. "Let them know you haven't forgotten." In her small home, filled with sunlight and paper, Clara's hope multiplied quietly. One letter, one soul, one heartbeat at a time. Weeks passed and Clara's strength began to wane again, but her spirit did not. She could feel her body slowing, her steps shorter, her breath lighter. Yet she did not fear it. The miracle was not that she was healed. It was that she was at peace. "You didn't change my ending," she said to God one morning. "You changed the way I walked toward it." The letters she'd sent began to return in new forms: cards, visits, calls. People who had long forgotten her now wrote back, touched by her words. "You reminded me that faith still lives," one note said. Another simply read, "Thank you for helping me believe again." She read each one slowly, tears falling onto the paper. Love had returned home. Her doctor came to visit one afternoon, checking her pulse, her breathing, her eyes. "You're weaker," he said gently, "but you look happy." She smiled. "Because I am. You see, I thought I was waiting to die. Turns out I was waiting to live again." He said nothing, only nodded, moved by something he couldn't name. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt the faint hum of life all around her. The ticking clock, the rustle of wind through the window, the soft glow of the lamp. Everything seemed to breathe in harmony. She whispered, "You're still here." The silence answered as always, with warmth. It wasn't a miracle anyone could measure or record. But for Clara, it was the greatest one of all. Hope had come back to stay, not loud, not fleeting, but patient, eternal, like light that refuses to go out. It came quietly, just before sunrise. Clara awoke to a strange stillness, not of pain, but of perfect calm. She turned her head toward the window, where the first light was breaking through the horizon. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her voice barely above breath. "You stayed." Her chest rose and fell slowly, rhythm steady, peaceful. She wasn't afraid. The fear that had once clung to her heart was gone, replaced by something vast and gentle. The dawn she had once feared now felt like invitation, the beginning of something beautiful, not the end of what had been. She thought of her letters, her daughter, her garden, her quiet prayers. Every piece of her life shimmered in her mind like fragments of light coming together. "Nothing was wasted," she said softly. "Every tear, every ache, every breath, you turned them into peace." Her eyes closed, a faint smile resting on her lips. Outside, birds began to sing. The sound wove through the open window like a hymn. The sky blushed pink and gold, the same colors she had loved since childhood. "It's a good morning," she whispered, "the best kind." Her body relaxed, her hand resting over her heart, the same heart he had touched and healed. And as the first ray of sunlight crossed her face, her breath slowed, then stilled. But the peace did not leave. It lingered, filling the room with quiet radiance. The dawn had come, and she had followed it home. The house was silent when the neighbors found her later that morning. She looked as though she had fallen asleep mid-prayer, her hands gently folded, her expression serene. The air felt different, softer, warmer, as if something holy had passed through and left its mark. On the table beside her sat an open Bible, a half-written letter, and a small cup of tea gone cold. They read her last unfinished sentence. "He didn't take away my pain. He gave it meaning." The words glowed in the morning light, simple yet eternal. They said she died peacefully, but heaven knew better. She had not died at all. She had simply stepped into the fullness of the hope she had been writing about. Outside, the wind carried the scent of her garden into the house. The flowers she had tended, weak and trembling, now stood tall in the sun. Life continued, as if to say that endings were only beginnings disguised. Those who visited her home spoke in whispers, touched by the peace that lingered there. Her daughter arrived days later, clutching the letter her mother had written weeks before. She read it by the window, tears streaming down her face. "You were right, Mama," she whispered. "Love doesn't end. It changes home." The sunlight touched her shoulder, and for a fleeting moment she felt warmth, familiar, comforting, eternal. And though Clara was gone from the world's sight, her story lived on. In her letters, in her garden, in every quiet soul who dared to hope again. Jesus had not stopped her from dying. He had taught her how to live forever.